Hi, everyone. Welcome to Ask a Human. I'm Trish McAllister with State Bar of Texas Law Practice Management Department. Today, we're doing a short episode where we answer AI questions from Texas lawyers in plain English with practical steps you can use today and clear guardrails so you can stay ethical and effective. Today, we have our expert, Kassi Burns, to answer your questions. Kassi, if you would introduce yourself.
Trish, thank you so much for having me join this Ask a Human series. I am Kassi Burns, an attorney based in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Fort Worth, for those of you, we want to be particular. I'm an attorney at King & Spalding, and my practice has been focused on e-discovery for most of my career. So that means I've been using AI in some aspect of my practice for 10, 15 years. So that's what brings me here today.
Well, thank you. Well, let's get started. So the first question is, how do I get started with AI?
Great question. Great starting question for this series, this monthly series. And I think the best answer I always tell people when they ask is start with low risk types of uses of generative AI. So when I started testing out generative AI, it was in my free time on things that captured my personal interest because I just wanted to see how those tools worked a little bit differently from how I've been using AI in my practice. And so, on my own machine, in my own free time, my own laptop, I would use these tools out there, whether it's ChatGPT or Claude or others, maybe Perplexity out there. And I would do things like, well, I want to plan a trip. So how can it maybe help me plan for that? Or there's a law that just passed that I'm interested in. Notebook LM is another AI tool that's out there where you can upload something and it will give you a summary and talking points and an outline and just being able to see how it quickly synthesized, but then also going in and validating the information once it really started creeping into more, substantive assessment of these tools. So a key element of using AI is there needs to be a human in the loop. If you've not heard that before, that's a concept, or in our case, a lawyer in the loop. That means we're not just letting the AI run rampant and not validating the results. As an e-discovery attorney, we've always had to use AI in a way where we had to defend our position because we've been using it historically in discovery in an adversarial setting. So we are used to validating the results, not assuming the results are the same. Something you learn as you play with AI, whether it's machine learning or generative AI, it is iterative. So don't expect the first result to be the best result. So, again, maybe starting with personal use and testing it out. If you have grandkids maybe and you want to write a story that is focused on, your grandchild, knowing that you may want to anonymize information about your grandchild, or, you want to, to be really personal, one way I used it, we had a dog that was sick that we were getting an MRI, a CT scan done, and it was going to be a while before we heard from the doctor. I loaded that up into ChatGPT and, it was a week before I heard from the doctor, and it gave me some information that kept me from worrying so much. And luckily, I knew, well, I still need to validate and know what the vet is going to tell me, but it explained that medical jargon in a way that I could understand. So, as you as an attorney begin using it more in your practice, be aware of a scale of potential risk associated with it. So let's say you're using it for business development, or you're using it for your internal operations, or you're using it to write an email or something of that kind, something of that nature, versus maybe helping draft a brief. That's what I would consider a higher risk category where there are elements in that have to be accurate when you certify that filing. So just as you would validate and QC and confirm something that a paralegal or a junior associate would write, so should you do the same. So, be aware of the risk, be aware of the uses, and apply the level of validation needed based on those elements. And one thing to remember as you're starting to use it in your practice, and we'll get into it in a little bit more details later, but just be aware some judges out there are issuing standing orders about AI. So just be aware if you're starting to use it in your practice in documents that have to be filed, make sure you check that in addition to all of the other concerns, the ethical, elements that you need to be aware of, confidentiality, validating accuracy, things like that.
That sounds perfect. Thank you so much, Kassi. That's a great way to get started, and I appreciate all that information. Very helpful. Moving on to the next question. How can I meaningfully evaluate and compare various law practice specific AI platforms, such as CoCounsel, to choose one or more that will best fit my practice and budget?
So I think that first assess how you want to use AI, or maybe even tackling it from a different perspective. What's a pain point in my practice that I think might be well suited for AI? It's a repeatable process. It's something that may be a level of risk that I'm comfortable with. I have maybe sufficient knowledge to, in essence, I am a subject matter expert in this area, and it's something that I could provide sufficient instructions to and easily validate. So think about the use case, and there's an array of tools that are coming out there. This question referenced CoCounsel, which I would describe as maybe a more legal research and general purpose legal AI tool. There are some that are getting maybe more specific about citation validation, checking for hallucinations. Some that are focusing on specific practices of law, like maybe family law or mergers and acquisitions. So think about what's a pain point that I want. Do you want something more general and you want to assess it, or do you want something more specific? Even if you want something more general, think about those use cases that make sense to you in your practice in a way that you can have a repeatable process and you can validate in a way that it makes sense. You're not over engineering. If you're having to spend so much time validating it because it's such a high risk and there's such a level of precision, it may not be worth it right now for you to test out. So think about those things and develop an assessment game plan. And part of that is going to be assessing the service provider, the deployer of that AI tool. And that will go into assessing what sort of confidentiality guardrails does that tool have? How is that data being used? Is it being used to train client data, which obviously would probably be problematic? Is there sufficient data protection? So we're protecting client proprietary, attorney-client privilege. So think about those more technical things, a vendor analysis type of assessment. And there are some materials on the Law Practice Management website that can help with that. But then also think about that fit in that use. So when you think about how might I want to use this initially, maybe create a scenario that you could test out. And so maybe that's, drafting a timeline, having it help with a chronology, or having it help you draft a brief perhaps, and have an example, an exemplar, and, an ideal result that you can use. And when you're talking to these service providers, try and get a proof of concept. A demo is great. A demo is great to conceptualize what a tool can do, but I highly recommend to everybody, you really want to play with it yourself, of course, making sure the data protection is there, the confidentiality is there, all of the technical secure elements are in play. You want to test it out yourself. So get that proof of concept, ideally trying to negotiate a no-cost one, because I know many people as solo practitioners, small law firms, you don't want to eat up your budget on just testing out the tool to see if it's worthwhile or not. So, and then playing with it and seeing if the results are sufficient for the cost in play. Will it save me time? Keeping in mind that using AI is iterative. The more you use it, especially maybe for a certain purpose, the better it will get because you will be able to refine the instructions with it over time. So you may spend time on the front end getting it set up and training it just as you would a junior associate a first year. And over time, you'll see those gains in efficiency. So just keep that in mind as you evaluate those tools.
That's good advice. Very good advice. And I like that, we just need to get in there and start using it. And then it'll help us with our own skills of, crafting a prompt and things like that. So thank you. How about the next question, which is really just a statement of, I just want to learn how it can be used outside legal research. So what are some other ways that people can use it?
I think one way that could be used, so I think one type of generative AI that may be more available for attorneys is Copilot. If your firm uses Microsoft's cloud-based version of Microsoft, you may have Copilot available. And that, in essence, has generative AI capabilities across most of the applications that are within that suite of tools. So Word or Outlook or Teams. So one thing that's featured there is if you have a Teams call, it can provide a transcript of that call. Now, of course, keeping in mind that you want to let the parties know that you're on the phone with, you're on the call with, that they're aware that there's a transcript being recorded. But those tools, instead of manually, maybe having a junior associate or maybe you trying to transcribe quickly after a call, I'm not going to say, again, you're still going to want to look at the output and see what the transcript is. And you can prompt with the Copilot and ask it to draft a summary of the call or draft action items. And that's an administrative type of task that can be incredibly helpful, especially if you have a lot going on. So maybe you even have a consolidated list of different raw notes and you want to clean it up and make it maybe more concise, whether it's an action plan or maybe it's some sort of, memo to file. Again, making sure this is assuming that the tool you're using has sufficient safeguards in place. One thing that AI can be good for too is it can address the tone and it can provide changes to a tone of an email. So, sometimes if you're really busy, maybe you're drafting an email to opposing counsel or you're drafting an email to a client that may not know that much about the legal issues. Maybe you draft it in your own words, but you can ask the tool, please rewrite this so it's more conciliatory or more neutral or more persuasive, or please redraft this so someone with a high school degree and no technical or legal knowledge will understand it. That can be very helpful because sometimes you're used to writing and what's in your brain, but sometimes having that translator as far as like the voice that will be best received by the audience can be particularly helpful. Even business development. So maybe you want to offer CLEs, to your potential client base or your community. You want to write a blog article, anything like that. It's incredibly useful. You want to ideate on ideals. I know I want to write something, and this is something that's really in my wheelhouse, but I'm really busy. I'm a solo practitioner. I don't have a lot of time on my hands. Being able to work with those tools and, prompting and saying, I want to write a blog article or a journal article about this topic. This is a point of view. These are the points I want to make. This is supporting documentation that supports my argument or my point of view. If you're able to go to it, again, think of it as a junior associate. You go to that junior associate and you say, this is the scope of what I want to write about. This is what you should refer to. It can do a really good job of that. And I recommend doing it in pieces, starting with an outline and iterating it. Like maybe it gives recommendations that it's too much noise, it's fluffy, it's not really on point, it's not concise enough. Get that outline and then start iterating and start building out some of the content maybe for first draft. And then you handle the editing, of course. So, there are a lot of ways to help in those regards. Fact discovery, perhaps helping with timelines. There are things that you need to do, of course, to validate that. But there's a huge spectrum out there of ways that AI can be used.
I love those ideas. I have to tell you, and while you were speaking, I thought, oh gosh, I do use it to do transcripts, make notes, things like that, create next steps. But I was like, what I really should be doing is using it to consolidate all the next steps that I have on the various projects that I'm involved in and create one big document, which would be really useful for lawyers who, have multiple or have, an administrative staff that are going to execute some of those steps, things like that. That's great. Thank you so much, Kassi. So the next question is, how can I use AI to review document production in litigation?
I will say that there's scales of document productions, and I want to be cognizant of that because I work in big law, so when I hear document production, it can be very large. It can be thousands and hundreds of thousands of documents. I would say, as far as I receive a document production from an opposing party and it's got 100,000 documents, just that's not going to be something that Copilot is going to be able to help with. That's something that Harvey or CoCounsel, from my opinion, would be able to help with. From one perspective, there's a limit in the amount of documents you can upload into them. There's also just traditional e-discovery software. It's built to support a workflow of reviewing and issue tagging and things like that. That the current Gen AI legal tools that are separate from e-discovery tools that are adding in generative AI capabilities, they're not really built for that. But if you are, a smaller mid-sized firm or even a big law firm and you're dealing with a case that's got smaller discovery, there could be the benefit of, I just received this production from opposing side and it's a few hundred documents and I want to assess what's there. It could be useful. I think you always have to consider what's there. So, let's maybe step back and say, I do sometimes get those large productions, and how can it still be useful? So as I mentioned, some of these e-discovery tools are integrating generative AI into their existing system, their existing tools, to try and make that process more efficient. Again, if you're using it to prepare your own production for the opposing side, there's still an element of negotiating that with the opposing side that's arguably not going to go away. But let's say, assuming that we have a tool and assuming we take the produced universe and get it down to a smaller set of documents, and that's your core set of documents that are going to be very useful to help you with deposition prep, help you develop your case strategy as you go. Using that in other tools, be it CoCounsel, Harvey, Copilot, making sure, that can possibly help with chronologies. It can possibly help with deposition prep. These are the ways that I'm seeing firms testing it out, So I think that being aware that discovery, especially if the volume is large, you're still most likely going to rely on those traditional e-discovery tools. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that it's really important, going back to the last item or the 2 items ago, making sure the tool you're using has sufficient data flow, uses guardrails. It's not using the data to train. It's not using the data you upload to train for the model in future use. It has sufficient privilege and confidentiality guardrails in place, because the data you receive is going to be protected. You're going to have an obligation to protect it pursuant to the protective order in that case. And uploading received productions to a publicly available tool that will train on the data, you're probably going to be in violation of that protective order, especially if the information is confidential. So just really being aware that those obligations are still in place with the received data, just like it is with your client data. And you really need to be careful about that. So, and also there may be language, you might start to see language in protective orders that talk about how generative AI may or may not be able to be used in data that you receive.
That's a good point. I hadn't even thought about that, but I'm sure that people are going to start seeing that. That's great information.
And sorry, and I would just, current through all of this, these tools still potentially hallucinate, especially if they're doing LLMs. So as we discussed before, that validation is really key. So if you use it to summarize a deposition transcript, you still want someone to look at that and confirm that that's accurate. So that is going to be something that's never going to go away.
Right. That's important to remember throughout the whole thing, every time we use it. All right. So our final question for today is, can AI read and use my historic documents that are in PDF format?
So this is a question I love because I have just out there in the general discourse of the use of generative AI, I have heard people, not legal e-discovery people, but people generally talk about, oh, these generative AI tools, they can read PDF documents, they can read handwriting, they can read information like that. So maybe to quickly address the question, AI and the way most of these legal focused generative AI tools are, they're going to look at the text of the document. And you're probably aware, and if you're not, definitely, letting you know now, there are systems in place that we've used heavily in e-discovery for a long time that in essence recognizes that there's a process that will look at a scanned document or a PDF that's not searchable, so it doesn't have that underlying text available as part of the file, that will scan the document and create the text. Now, if it's a very, very old document or it's a PDF that maybe it's a scanned PDF of a hard copy document that the scan is poor quality, the quality of the text is as good as the quality of the scan or the PDF. And there's not an absolute, level of guarantee of perfection. So that's always going to be a challenge, at least right now. These generative AI tools are still reliant on the text of the data, whether it's the native text or the text created through that text analysis, text recognition process called OCR. So that is, something to be aware of. Generative AI tools, legal generative AI tools may not be well suited for all types of data. So if you have poorly scanned, and I've seen it do pretty well and do a pretty good job, but maybe it doesn't capture or analyze the handwriting very well. So that's something to be aware of. If you have large Excel documents, it may not be able to analyze that very well. And if your Excel document has multiple worksheets and they kind of relate to each other, that might not work out very well. So, as of right now, similar to the struggles that we still have today in traditional e-discovery tools, there is still a bit of a blind spot or a pain point in PDFs that don't have good quality text that can be recognized, or certain data types. For example, a large Excel, our robust traditional AI tools in e-discovery won't necessarily analyze those very well. It still might review a human review. So it's still a work in progress, but that's a really great question to be asking. I would say test it out and see what that tool is able to provide, and just be aware that that may be a limitation.
That's a good idea. Good point. Yeah, to be honest, I hadn't even thought about that. So I'm so glad somebody asked that question, because when I first saw the question, I thought, well, sure, but I had not obviously thought deep enough about that question. So thank you so much, Kassi.
And I think that goes into, part of using the tool is more than likely you're going to use a prompt and also have other materials that you're asking it to analyze.
Right.
So really just being aware of what that data set or that data curation is made up of. Like if it, especially as you start to use it, and you might know, well, I know that there are going to be some hard copy documents that are scanned. I have a company that it's been around for over 100 years. Maybe they're oil and gas company, or they're, in
Yeah.
some industry where, we still think everything is email and chats, but there's a large portion of our clients that still have, that sort of like legacy documents out there.
Right.
Just being aware of what that data, those documents are composed of, and knowing that, some of it may not be well suited for Gen AI right now. It just sets you up for success in using it. So,
Yeah, that's such great information. Well, thank you so much, Kassi, for joining us and providing your incredibly deep knowledge on AI and how to use it, especially in e-discovery. Um, so yeah, we're deeply indebted to you. And for those of you who are watching this, we'll be continuing this series, hopefully on a monthly basis, to address all the questions that we received during our initial AI or Ask a Human AI Q&A webinar in November, and then obviously answering any questions that we get in the interim too. So thank you so much, and we will see you hopefully next month. Thanks, Kassi.
of course.